Back again is my good friend, Professor Ralph Hancock from Brigham Young University. He and another BYU professor get into a back and forth through published articles at Public Square magazine around the issue of an odd marriage between BYU and journalist Jonathan Rauch. This opens up so many issues about the church and about BYU in terms of who are your bedfellows and why. This interview with Ralph is a response to that BYU professor who's challenging Ralph and his questioning on this relationship with Rauch. Now, this episode is brought to you by Fathom the Good. Fathom the Good is a high school curriculum based on the question of the good. In a world that is seemingly falling apart and becoming more and more woke, this high school homeschooling curriculum grounds kids into the idea of what is the good based on political philosophy and the founding of America. This will help your kids develop critical thinking and an understanding of how to find the good in a situation, how to recognize it. The curriculum is based off of Ralph's life's work, and the courses are phenomenal. They've just added also an adult course. Go to fathomthegood.com to find out more. Here's the interview. So, Ralph, there's a lot of talk about compromise in politics within the church, both the church as an entity itself and with the members of the church. We've talked a lot about this. There's been a recent response to some articles that you put out in Public Discourse from a colleague of yours, Kelly Patterson, at Public Square magazine. Let me ask you this question as far as Latter-day Saints and liberalism. Can Latter-day Saints engage with liberalism without compromising their doctrine and their principles and beliefs?
Thank you, Greg. Well, first of all, I appreciate my colleague Kelly Patterson's response, which was intelligent and challenging, as one would expect from Dr. Patterson. And it does provide an opportunity to clarify the stakes of the debate, or let's say the stakes of the engagement between Latter-day Saints and liberalism, which remains to be defined. At the same time, the question itself tends to, there's some ambiguity or slipperiness in the question in probably more than one respect. What does it mean to engage, and what is liberalism? So these are things that we'll be talking about. But let's start with engagement. Not only can Latter-day Saints engage with liberalism, let's just for now posit that something we might call liberalism is the dominant socio-political, intellectual environment. Liberalism defines our world in important respects. So can Latter-day Saints engage it? Well, they must. In a way, we can't help it. We're engaged in it. It's there before us in a certain way. We're engaged in it whether we choose to or not. If we want to engage liberalism reflectively and in full knowledge of what's at stake. The problem is that the language of engaging liberalism is often understood in a how shall I say, a pre-formatted liberal way, like to engage liberalism as liberals would, or to engage liberalism on liberal assumptions. And we'll have to sort out what all that means. But I think we can, Latter-day Saints can and must engage liberalism. I mean, that's what I've tried to do in engaging Jonathan Rauch and his Latter-day Saint admirers, for example.
Let me ask you real quick, though, as we're talking about liberalism, just to be clear, you're speaking of liberalism in the terms of how we would use that in the United States as liberal versus conservative. Is that correct? Or are we talking about more of a political philosophy? And like, as an example, if I go to the UK and I talk about liberalism or the liberals, you're going to probably have more people on the right that are going to associate themselves with that than you would on the left.
That's true in France too. Liberalism or neoliberalism is associated with free market economics,
Yes.
especially as opposed to what? As opposed to socialism,
Mm-hmm.
I suppose. The constellation of terms has evolved differently in the United States, and we could try to trace this back 100 years to progressivism and the New Deal. What happened is that in the United States, the progressive movement, I think one could say the pro-statist movement, or the movement for the expansion of the powers, the size, the prerogatives of the national state in particular, appropriated for itself the term liberal. So that leads to these paradoxes between the European and Latter-day Saint notions of liberalism. All that's interesting and should be taken into account in discussing Latter-day Saints and liberalism. But actually, something more fundamental is going on today, and I would say that the fundamental question of liberalism for us Latter-day Saints needs to be parsed in terms of a distinction between liberalism in practice and the theory or the pure theory of liberalism. So,
And you're engaging here with more of the practice.
well, I think in a certain sense, I'm a liberal, as you are. We're not illiberal anti-constitutionalists who reject the American founding, for example. That has long been a tendency on the American left, and now it's also a tendency on the American right. I don't think it's by even close to a dominant tendency, but there's a significant intellectual and social media movement which is indeed illiberal. And there are important, formerly, I would say, conservative political theorists who have turned illiberal. And for me, the decisive turning point is when you turn against the American founding and regard the American founders as part of the problem in terms of the health, the stability, the freedom of our society, and not part of the solution. We're liberals because we regard the American founders and American constitutional republicanism as a standard by which to judge and evaluate as a high standard. But now we have illiberals, left and right, and sorting out where we should stand as citizens and as Latter-day Saints with regard to liberalism requires us to sort all that out. Now, I think, again, a useful distinction to make is between liberalism in practice and liberalism in theory. And I was going to say, I'm in favor of the historical practice of liberalism going back to the American founding, and I would say nowhere better articulated in its full amplitude than in the work of Alexis de Tocqueville, in Tocqueville's Democracy in America, for example. This practical liberalism is something we all recognize, and I think all people of passably goodwill are willing to concede the benefits of this liberal constitutionalism. We have limited government, personal freedoms guaranteed by a constitution, a separation of powers with checks and balances, elected officials who are replaced peaceably by newly elected officials. These elements of liberalism are things that we should embrace. But I would say for the American founders, and more explicitly, with more philosophical depth, Tocqueville understood that these liberal practices depended upon some elements that liberalism as a theory could not supply. Call it virtue, or you could name belief in God. One has to look no further than George Washington's farewell address, in which he explicitly addressed the question of, what shall we call it, political atheism, in which he explicitly referred to the question whether a people can be virtuous. First of all, a Republican Constitution needs a virtuous people. Can a people be virtuous without a belief in God? And Washington, you can read the words yourself, but he basically said, some fancy philosophers say so, but I don't think so. That's not going to work for you. Mm-hmm. And there was already, or there would soon be, the example of the French Revolution to bring fully to light the consequences of an attempt at an atheistic, or let's say post-Christian, purely deistic liberal republicanism. It didn't work. It's unstable. So I think the question of Latter-day Saints and liberalism sometimes runs afoul of this distinction, because those of us who are inclined to criticize the pure philosophical premises of a certain liberalism, which has come to the fore practically today, pure theoretical liberalism, we are accused of being illiberal. For example, if you believe that we should have a country with borders, and that we have a right to prefer ourselves and to prioritize the common good of a country over some pure liberal abstraction of universal human rights, then you're taken to be illiberal. But our liberal founders were founding a country. That's what the Declaration was all about. It's a declaration of a people's right to form a government that best suits or serves their happiness.
So explain this to me. So I look at this, a lot of people define the left and the right differently. You've got a number of people that will say, well, the left tends over toward tyranny, and the right is anarchy. If you go too far on either side, I don't believe that. I think it's a circle. I think that you go too far on extremes on both sides, you end up in tyranny, period. But I think that I look at the left and the right more in terms of, including liberalism here, more in terms of psychology than I would even just saying, so what are your politics? I think that your psychology determines this, your worldview determines this. And liberalism says, okay, well, we don't like the status quo. The status quo is not good. It excludes certain people. It's built for certain people. So we need to loosen this up, liberalize it more, and allow for some change. We tolerate some change. Whereas a conservative side will say, well, we're going to conserve the status quo more. We're going to lean more toward that and not change as much, and we're going to protect more of the status quo, right? The problem is that you always have to have an order in place, right? And if you allow too much liberalism to occur in any situation, a company, a country, anything, you're opening the door further and further to chaos and losing that structure of the status quo and order. And so I look at that as, I believe there needs to be liberalism. I think that liberalism needs to be a part of that because it has to check the status quo to a certain degree. But it's when you open the door all the way and you focus on liberalism completely, you're basically going to start tearing down the structure. You're going to tear down the status quo, and you're going to allow chaos to envelop the society. Does that make sense?
No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you approach it from the angle of psychology, which is really just a way of saying human nature. Mm-hmm. So there's really no clear divide, I would say, between a psychological approach and the one that I'm more conversant in. Let's call it a philosophical approach. We're dealing with human nature and the social and psychological needs of human beings, which I will grant you at the outset involve both individual freedom and, let's say, common or shared or societal order, right? So, yeah, we're still in pretty abstract terms, but I think we can agree that that wise, prudent political thinkers and actors need to keep in mind the requirements of both individual freedom and communal order. That's just a way of endorsing what you just said. But I would add this. Here's where the atheoretical component of liberalism becomes important, because the liberal idea, the pure theory of liberalism, of which I'm quite suspicious, as you can see, the pure theory of liberalism is a theory of individual freedom and equality. And these are two sides of the same coin. Mm-hmm. The individual in a pure state of nature, all individuals are equal because they're free, and free because they're equal. You will hear the voice of a founder of liberalism such as John Locke, if liberalism has any single founder, I suppose, as a philosopher. John Locke would be the first name that we might cite. And those ideas are familiar to us, good American constitutionalists and liberals. They seem to echo in our Declaration of Independence, for example. And I'm in favor of the spirit of freedom and equality, but I'm not in favor of that making up the sole pure foundation of a worldview, because what it denies, you put in terms of the status quo. That's not maybe the most attractive way to say, why not talk about a concern for the common good, or a shared sense of the good, or what kind of society and what kind of human being we're trying to provide for and encourage. And liberalism, in its pure theoretical form, cannot address that question. I won't say merely it cannot answer it, it cannot even open itself to it.
The question of the good.
A question of the good, right. The question of what makes our freedom good, and how is a good freedom different from a bad freedom, or the good use of freedom different from a bad use of freedom. So to go back to the distinction that I introduced early on between liberalism in theory and liberalism in practice. Liberalism in practice is sound and healthy because it's not pure theoretically, because it recognizes that liberalism needs, call it conservatism, call it some respect for the status quo, because what makes the status quo, what gives authority to the status quo, is that in some way, to some degree, it represents settled ideas about what kind of people we are and what we mean by not only freedom but virtue and happiness, for example. So I would say that what's happened is that the pure theory of liberalism, which starts in a godless, we can say atheistic state of nature in which the individual is beholden to no one and nothing, in which in which our freedom has no meaning. In this pure theoretical state of nature, defining the pure liberal theory of freedom and equality, our freedom has no natural or God-given orientation, no guidance from God or nature. Human life has no meaning but what is constructed. Liberalism in its foundations is already radical, if you want me to compress the argument. It's not a historical accident that radicalism, wokeness, transformative, revolutionary delusions has arisen from liberalism. It's in the DNA of liberalism when that liberalism insists on separating itself from its, shall we call it, conservative, its moral, religious foundations and basis.
Yeah, so again, I mean, you're talking about going out, that liberal focus is going to, revolution, wokeness, all of these definers are all in that realm, I would say, of change. Mm-hmm. Right? They're going out into that idea of change. And how do we produce change without compromising core principles and the good, right? Because that's what kind of comes up. That's where, in the article, for example, you've got Patterson here talks about, I think it's in his actual title, no, it's in the subtitle, right? Faith can lead with courage rather than fear. So there's an implication that your approach to this is based on fear or producing fear. And so, again, what I see is I've got a circle here of where we're at. There's a push to go outward. And if you say, no, that outward looks dangerous, then all of a sudden you're fear-mongering, right? Yeah. You're moving out into that area, so you must be fear-mongering. I get this all the time with my episodes. I mean, you're a fear-monger, Greg. And I'm like, no, I'm looking at the consequences of where this would lead.
I would say you're reality-mongering.
Sure, okay.
Well, to respect reality for a pure theoretical liberal counts as fear-mongering, doesn't it? Because if you start with the basis that there is no human meaning but human constructions, human devices, human imagination, then reality is a nuisance. And any appeal to, like, let's say, the real general contours of human nature or the real enduring facts of human society, these realities are an encumbrance. But there's another factor to keep in mind here, because this liberal movement away from what you defined as the status quo, away from respect for, let's say, any shared and settled notion, defined notion of a common good or of the kind of human being that we want to encourage and look up to. The fact is that a liberal cannot define the direction outwards. Well, the way you expressed it is perfectly telling, because liberalism in its pure theoretical form, which becomes progressivism and radicalism, I'll throw that all together, sure, is a movement away from. Mm-hmm. It is destructive. If you ask it, and I think this is clear in Jonathan Rauch's argument in Cross Purposes, the book I critiqued, and in my colleague Kelly Patterson's defense of it, if you embrace liberalism as the movement away from any settled beliefs in the name of individual freedom and equality, then you have no answer to the question, to what end, for what purpose? This is more than a theoretical fine point, because this is why liberalism becomes radicalism. It becomes destructive because it only knows what it wants to destroy or deconstruct, or, in milder forms, progress beyond. But it can't move away from. It cannot name what the progress is for, because to name what the progress is for, we would have to appeal to already shared notions. We would have to appeal in some way to what is derisively called the status quo. Not that, reform or positive change can be denied wholesale, but rather that, and this is a point, going back to the founder of modern conservative liberalism, Edmund Burke, reform needs to respect the goods that are already there, and to know it's only with reference to goods of which we have some concrete experience individually and communally. It's only with respect to such goods that we can speak soberly, coherently about what it would mean to reform or to do better.
Yeah, it's and bringing this into even more into the gospel, I think you can see the same type of approach, and this is why I say it's a worldview. It's because inevitably, as we're talking about this liberalism and moving away, it's the same. It's not just politics. It's principles. It's gospel practices and beliefs, where the same exact thing happens. And so, and I reference this sometimes, but I was in an interview with I was interviewing the scholar Patrick Mason, and I'm talking to him about. We were talking about, I think it was same-sex marriage in the temple. And yeah, that's what it was. And his idea on this was, look, there are concentric circles of truth and doctrine, and on the outer fringe of those are not as set, right? And so they are ones that maybe could change. And as you get into the core, basically talking about things like the atoning sacrifice of Jesus Christ and the restoration of with Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormon. You've got these things right center in the core here, but other things can be possibly changed. That's the same idea, right? It's a mentality to me. It's a viewpoint that says change is required in almost anything that you're going to focus on, and that obsession with that change then becomes radical. And wants to change the status quo. Now, that's fine to a degree if you're talking about way out here in the fringes of these concentric circles. You can battle it, for example, in politics. What's the tax rate going to be? How large does the government get? And different things like that. Okay, fine. Those are kind of on the outside. We'd have opinions on them and what's better and worse. But when you come into the founding principles of the United States, and those then at the core then begin to fall apart, now you've got a real problem. And it's the same thing with the gospel. If we have the core principles that are going to be radicalized, the nature of God, these things now, which we deal with right now, and that comes from a liberal standpoint, a liberal attack, a deconstruction on those principles.
Well, and the pure theoretical liberal strategy is always to, how shall I say, to reject things from the core and ever further towards the concentric, concentric circle, to deny that what we've always thought was core is really core. And so this tendency to, so it's interesting to track, what counts as the core. For Patrick Mason, is it Jesus' love and atoning sacrifice? That's not a bad start for defining a core. But look, here's a decisive question for me. This is what makes me a moral or anthropological realist. I believe in some permanent features of human nature that have to do with our creation and our design, our divine destiny. But how many of these features can be whittled down and rejected to some further concentric circle? In my view, if Christ's love, and you will recognize the theme of my book, which I've promoted in your presence before, Greg, which is finally actually in the publication process, Love and Virtue in a Secular Age. Allow me to mention it because this is what we're talking about, love and virtue. As soon as we as soon as we sever love from virtue or from a certain understanding of human character, of morality, and of the human good, then love devolves into your teddy bear Jesus or some infinitely malleable conception, which gives us no very definite guidance about how we should live, and which then makes our Christianity very easy to meld with this pure liberal belief in ultimate human freedom and equality without any divine or natural guidance in terms of permanent moral reference points.
Yeah, and you had said previously here that the liberalism devolves into progressivism, which we could talk about that too, but revolution and et cetera. And that it does it without, did you say purpose or goal or?
Well, it cannot. Yeah, its only goal is negative. Finally, it knows what it wants to be liberated from. You could say liberty becomes liberation. It evolves rather naturally. Liberty without a moral compass devolves rather naturally into liberationism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I would say that there is, though, a motivation there beyond, or at least it's a carrot that helps incite and develop that worldview, and that is empathy and compassion. That seems to be the reasoning and the you talk about love and virtue. If those are corrupted in a way where they're not tethered to truth and they're not tethered to those core principles, you can still use as a motivating factor to rally people empathy and love and mercy and et cetera, without tethering them to these truths. And I would say that conservatism is more tethered to those things, whereas progressivism, especially getting out toward progressivism, it does not have a tethering to these truths. It doesn't have a tethering to that order. And so it goes off and it says, I will take what is understood in an umbrella of love and virtue and draw only what I can siphon out without the truth, without the tethering. I can siphon out empathy and compassion and use that as a motivating focus.
Okay, so what's left then? What is the, you might say, what is the content or what is the sort of the anthropological substance of this residual empathy, compassion that's supposed to stand for, that is supposed to be the, I suppose, our modern version of Christian love or charity? What view of the human person is implicit in this? Because you have the motivations of the supposedly selfless, political, social, or religious agent looking out for the good of others. But what is the good of the others? How is that good conceived? And I think there are two main answers. I mean, what's left over when you strip away what's left in the status quo of traditional and religious anthropologies, conceptions of human nature and the human good? Well, we can consult the history of liberalism, and it's irresistible to put on my historian of political philosophy hat here just for a minute, because the path of modern liberalism is so clear. If you begin with Hobbes and Locke, then what's left over to be compassionate about are simply the material needs, the selfish material needs of the human being as an animal in the state of nature. In Hobbes, it's crystal clear. The only thing that matters is saving your skin, is physical self-preservation. That's the bottom line, and that's the standard of all moral and political rules and action.
Like a hyper-libertarianism. Yeah, hyper-libertarianism.
And Locke softens that a bit, but still, for Locke, the human being whose good we should attend to or address is understood as a materially acquisitive animal, a restless, anxious being who always wants more property. And we can all recognize this is a recognizable feature of human nature, at least in certain circumstances. And it can do much good too, and Locke's theory has produced much good in unleashing the economically productive powers of this acquisitive human nature. But we're still talking essentially about a materialistic understanding of the human person. So if you say we should care about our fellow man or love our neighbor, what being are we loving? Are we loving an acquisitive, an endlessly restless, never at peace, acquisitive being for whom there is no definition of good but more material property? That seems rather thin. But to go to another stage, beginning with Rousseau, so I won't try to spell out all the history of political philosophy here, but this anthropology underline our understanding of a social good, or the object of what you've named today as compassion and empathy. What has that become today? Authenticity. The self that creates itself, the self that defines itself. This is obviously something that, Hobbes and Locke had too much sense and they were too sober to embrace this idea of the human self detached from all natural fixed points.
Natural law.
Yeah, from natural law, yeah. But beginning with Rousseau, and I suppose we could trace an arc from Rousseau to Jean-Paul Sartre in France and existentialism, and we could connect with postmodernism and critical race theory. But underlying all these late modern or postmodern visions of human anthropology is this idea of the purpose of the self as being the self, as being, you see how you can hear this already in Rousseau's State of Nature, being identical with yourself, being just who you are, not letting any hierarchical social standards be imposed upon you, but only expressing your authentic self. So my point is, and it's taken a long way around, my point is that the vocabulary of love, and even more so the vocabulary of empathy or compassion, which for me tend to be degraded ways of talking about the Christian concept of love. But these ways of talking about love or compassion continue to presuppose some idea of a human person. They are not neutral. Liberalism is not neutral, and radicalized progressive or woke liberalism is even less so. It understands the being for whom we're supposed to have compassion for as a self-creating self, for whom there is no higher motive than authenticity. So really, authenticity rules empathy in that framework. Authenticity is the ground, and empathy is, or authenticity is the master, and empathy is the servant in that formula, I would say. So,
it's interesting you bring that up, and you bring the DNA up, the French DNA up, and Rousseau, Sartre, and going into the postmodernists. And, it's interesting because on the left, the further left you go, the more it is true, is that you do believe firmly in a social engineering. Things are socially engineered, including gender, for example. Mm-hmm. And they even try and say biology to some degree is socially engineered. And yet at the same time, as you're explaining it, they're saying, no, you want to be your authentic self. Well, that authentic self can't be authentic then if everything's socially engineered, right? If you are socially engineered, how can you how can you strive for authenticity? What would that even mean?
Well, the social engineering, this contradiction lies at the heart of liberalism, and even more clearly so in radicalized liberalism. Freedom has no meaning, and therefore we must create it. But the only meaning we can create is in negating the status quo that exists. So not every construction of the self counts as authentic, does it? I mean, you can say that feminism, for example, here I'll step into the feminist controversy. It might add to your viewership, or at least to your the commentary on this. But feminism, and I realize there are all different kinds of feminism, but at its core, feminism proposes to allow women to choose for themselves the meaning of their femininity and the meaning of their life as human beings. But you'll notice that not all meanings count equally. A mother who chooses to take on the burden of a traditional family and the moral restrictions and the very heavy duties involved in bearing and raising children, that doesn't seem quite authentic, because such a woman is clearly accepting a narrative that is inherited from the past, or that seems to acknowledge a power higher than the self. So the only really authentic feminist is one who goes against all previous social constructions, and who is actively involved in reconstructing, in the creation of meaning, in creation of a new role. So authentic womanhood cannot really be, feminists may more or less tolerate the obviously necessary existence of some wives and mothers, but the ideal of feminism, insofar as it is based on the pure theory of modern liberalism, which it tends to be, has to be creative, constructive. It has to replace one social engineering with another, you might say. It has to restlessly move on to some new invention of the self, or of the idea of womanhood, or new manipulation of the idea of gender.
Now, Patterson, in his article here, goes through a response to your articles about Rauch, and we've discussed this before, but he brings up, he makes a statement here saying that Hancock's critique of Rauch seems to be that Rauch's olive branch is really a poisoned apple. Okay, what does he mean by that?
He's exactly right. That's what I think. That's what I think.
Yeah, it is a poisoned apple. So how is Rauch, right? Let's just briefly talk about him for a second here. Rauch is he's with the Brookings Institute. He's a journalist, highly regarded, and an atheist, and he has reached out to the church in some regard, including in his book, talking about the church and how the church acts very differently from a lot of the balance of Christianity, right, in terms of how they engage politics. And to some degree, I agree with that. To some degree, I agree with that. We take a much more neutral stance on some things than you would get in other churches, especially some Protestant evangelical churches. And that's probably actually going to expand. That disparity is going to expand with the new IRS rulings, where churches are now able to actually full-on proselytize from the pulpit their politics. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, Rauch, in my mind, seems to, I believe it's also a poisoned apple, not that he's willing to create a bridge, but that bridge is qualified by his idea of compromise. And he speaks of this all the time in his speech at BYU, and in compromise, which is basically, I see it as I need to compromise on my principles, and that's what he's excited about.
Yeah, so that you need to compromise on your principles so you can be part of the quite new status quo that I, Jonathan Rauch, think is basically okay and not a bad place to land, at least for now, while we try to prepare for more progress further in some direction, no doubt. But look, the whole point is to see, and I'm not sure why my colleague, Professor Patterson, has trouble seeing this. I suppose he's read the whole book that I've studied with care, but some things are unmistakable, and it is simply the case that Jonathan Rauch's viewpoint is not neutral. He's not sort of saying, I'm going to bracket all my beliefs so I can listen to you. I ask you to do the same so you can listen to me, and we can talk about a good society or a sound and workable definition of our rights and duties and so forth. No, that's not what he's doing. He's saying a certain stage of liberal society has emerged, post-Obergefell especially, and I think that's good, and I see signs that Latter-day Saints are ready to compromise with it, and I want to keep encouraging that, and encouraging you not to fall back into your habits of prejudice and oppression and superstition. Look, read the book. This is the way he talks about traditional religion. If you think he's just inviting us to a neutral negotiation, no. But this bears on the question of engagement that we started with. Maybe, is it good to engage liberalism? You and I are doing it right now. How can we not think it's good? But we want to engage it knowingly, astutely, and yes, courageously, but courage does not consist in denying the real downsides and pitfalls. Jonathan Rauch has a worldview. It is decidedly secular, atheistic, and I would say scientific in a sense I would regard as narrowly reductionist. He has that worldview, but somehow it dawned on him that this worldview did not produce all the motives for good citizenship that would be needed in a liberal society. So why not look for versions of Christianity that can supply the necessary motives for virtue? He's basically shopping about for religious supports for a view of liberalism that he shows no readiness to negotiate upon at any deep level at all. So he's really asking Latter-day Saints and asking us to be a model for other Christians in lending our moral support, using our belief in God and no doubt in heaven and hell, for example, using our beliefs to form moral behaviors and character traits that are needed in a liberal society. Even though he does not believe in he explicitly rejects the theological foundation of those religious beliefs. And it's at this point that Professor Patterson, I must say, he goes so far as to surprise me a bit by asking, why cannot an atheist be a worthy conversation partner in thinking about how to be Christ-like? Why would we need actual beliefs about Christ's divinity or the plan of salvation or, let's say, the moral purpose, God's moral purpose in the universe? Why would we need any of that to support our deepest moral beliefs? And why could we not expect a committed, determined atheist to tell us how to be a good Christian. I mean, for me, the question is really kind of preposterous on its face. Do we not believe that our vision of God, of ultimate reality, of the plan of salvation, of who we are as children of God, matters in shaping the way we live our lives and the character traits we hold to be most important? If by engaging with liberalism, Jonathan Rauch or Kelly Patterson mean engaging in liberalism as liberals, or setting aside all your attachments to supra-liberal beliefs and assumptions in order to engage on a liberal terrain, then I'm saying no. I invite you to come over to my terrain. Is that fearful? I think it's sober and brave. It's a recognition of reality. It's a recognition that life is not just a conversation or an exploration of possibilities. Reality matters. None of us sees it perfectly. We don't have any complete theory or theology of reality, certainly not one that we would impose on fellow citizens. But if we're to engage liberalism, we must not do it by completely bracketing or stripping away from ourselves our most fundamental convictions.
So as you went through the article, what were a few of the points that you saw that did you think that you talk about the poison apple here, you say that's right on, he got that right, that's how I felt. Was there anything in there that you felt that you did not agree with the way that he interpreted your articles?
Yeah, there are. In a way, what's most significant is that he understands what I'm saying and he disagrees with it. He sees the world more like Jonathan Rauch than he does like me, a fellow Latter-day Saint. Is that my fault? Is that his fault? Is that Rauch's fault? But that's a fact to begin with. In a certain way, with the help of Charles Taylor and other more or less postmodern philosophers, or late liberal philosophers.
Charles Taylor's the
Canadian author of A Secular Age and Sources of the Self. I can go into that. That's the business I'm in, is sort of discussing such philosophers as Charles Taylor. But I was going to say, Professor Patterson is willing to adopt that worldview of there are no fixed points which we should bring to a discussion, but everything is up for negotiation because we now live in a secular age, Charles Taylor's reference, in which all options are open and nobody really believes as they used to believe, as if it's simply true, but we all believe, we know that there are different options and possibilities. In a word, a kind of relativism is part of the very air that we breathe in a modern society. And Professor Patterson's viewpoint seems to be, let's live within that relativized society and explore and negotiate within it, and not be dogmatic in holding to any fixed viewpoints and so forth. And I just think that's a distortion of our situation. Do we know nothing? Even if we're willing to listen and, let's say, to momentarily to bracket, as we engage secular liberals and others, we Latter-day Saints, sure, for purposes of conversation and learning, we need to be willing to listen, to respect other viewpoints, even momentarily to bracket and say, what if what I think is true is not quite as clear and certain as I might have thought it was? That's all part of the intellectual life. But the fact is, Jonathan Rauch, and I could add Charles Taylor to this, there's certain things they don't question. This is very clear in the case of Jonathan Rauch. Look, you brought up marriage already, so let's. This is a. Why do we avoid a concrete question like this? Jonathan Rauch celebrates I would say, the complete transformation of marriage, if not the abolition of traditional marriage, by redefining marriage, unilaterally using, I was going to say, legislative power or the power of the Supreme Court to redefine marriage, completely severing it from what was the core of its meaning, what was the anthropological basis of its meaning, through notable variations in the contours of marriage throughout history. Like it's a man-woman making a baby thing that is at the that's why we have marriage. It's not just so we can have sweet thoughts about one form of companionship or another between adult human beings. It had to do with a man-woman child thing. That has been abolished. And Jonathan Rauch celebrates it, or he makes it clear we are not going back on that. He makes it clear, you want to talk about respecting others' views? He is sure, he has absolutely no respect for anyone who thinks that homosexuality is a sin, or let's back off from that, who thinks that it's a mistake for the stability and health of society to radically transform the definition of marriage. He has no respect for that. See, so he's not neutral. He's asking us to engage him on his terrain. And Professor Patterson is saying, I'm not afraid to engage him on his terrain. And I'm saying, maybe you should be a little bit afraid, maybe a little bit wary of engaging him on his terrain.
Well, this is something that I had noticed in the article that I thought, though, as he uses the term respect or respecting others' opinions, I'm talking about Patterson here, he doesn't parse this out very well. I respect your right to believe what you want, right? That is the common ground that we should all have. You have a right to believe what you want to believe in. And that should be the ground that we sit on and say, okay, we can discuss this together. But I may not respect your actual beliefs. I may not respect your opinions. That is very different.
Yeah.
You need to think what you need. You have a freedom of religion. You adopt your worldview. You decide what you want to do. I will not only support that, I would fight for that, even if I disagree and don't respect your opinions at all. But that respecting your ability, your right to have your own beliefs, your own worldview, your own religion, does not mean that comes with me respecting what you believe. That doesn't make any sense to me. If I respected what you believed, I would believe what you believe.
Yeah. Well, Professor Patterson he does us a great service here. This, I think, is in a way his strongest point, and really the point where he helps us advance the argument the most, because he calls attention to this idea of respect, and therefore, I think, requires us to recognize, no doubt more clearly than I have done so far in my work on Jonathan Rauch, but he calls on us to recognize the rhetorical ambiguity, you could even say the slipperiness within the term respect. Now, Professor Patterson, actually his article relies a lot upon an argument from authority, and he does well to call upon the authority of President Oaks, and especially a speech he gave at the University of Virginia, in which respect for others and for the opinions of others plays a central role. But I think Kelly's own argument makes it clear that we have to think more carefully about the meaning of respect, because in a familiar, practical, rhetorical way, we talk about respecting others and their beliefs. But I agree with what you just pointed out. To be clear, I respect you as you I'm going to let you be Jonathan Rauch. I respect you, Jonathan, as a child of God and a person with much good and eternal potential and with many admirable qualities, intelligence and a civic disposition, all kinds of things I can attribute to you. I respect you. You hold the belief that the redefinition of marriage, severing it completely from the role of reproduction and responsible parenthood, is a good thing. I'm convinced that's not true. Are you, Jonathan, willing to respect my viewpoint and take it seriously? Nothing in your book or in any of your writings suggests that you do. I will say I respect you. Because I respect you as a person, I'm willing to try to walk a mile in your shoes and to see how you would have come to this viewpoint and the arguments that exist for it. But finally, no, I cannot say in full lucidity that I respect your viewpoint. I mean, practically speaking, it's a decent and amicable way of dealing with people to respect them and their beliefs. But what we mean is we respect them. Now let's talk about your beliefs. I respect the fact that you have beliefs. I can with a little work, I can see how you come to such beliefs. But really, the language of respect is of little use here because I think you're wrong, and that's what's most important. Does that mean I am acting on fear? It means, yeah, I believe. Let me lay down another mark here. I believe that the Obergefell decision and the new regime of abolishing the traditional idea of marriage is a disaster. So can I deal with it? Am I afraid of it? I'm dealing with it. I'm living in this world. Is the culture war over? We're to the language of the culture wars now. On that point, you could argue that the culture war has been settled. Well, we have to live with it. Maybe we have to negotiate the new terrain that exists given that political reality. I'll bracket the question whether such a thing might be reversible in some future developments in American politics and society, but let's just assume it's not reversible. I think it's important to say it's a fact. There was a culture war. On this point, we lost, and it's a disaster. In my articles on the Rauch subject in Alive and Intelligent, I quoted President Oakes on the priority of truth to tolerance, which would kind of give us the right perspective from which to understand what he means by respect, I think. But I also quoted Professor Christofferson in General Conference on Sustainable Societies. And
Elder Christofferson.
And I may have that quotation here. When secularization separates personal and civic virtue from a sense of accountability to God, that's Rauch's whole project. Mm-hmm. And Professor Patterson says, now, why would that be a problem? I don't see why. Why cannot ethical ideas be detached from the laws of nature and nature's God? I don't see what the connection is, Professor Patterson is saying. When secularization separates personal and civic virtue from a sense of accountability to God, it cuts the plant from its roots. That's my whole difference from Professor Patterson. He thinks that we can have civic virtues of negotiation and niceness without any roots. He thinks we can be pure liberals without the conservative foundation or the conservative roots. Continuing Elder Christofferson, reliance on culture and tradition alone will not be sufficient to sustain virtue in society. So our status quo is not just a status quo, it requires belief in some transcendent reality. When one has no higher God than himself, that's the late modern, the radicalized liberal ethic of the self, authenticity that we've been talking about. When one has no higher God than himself and seeks no greater good than satisfying his own appetites and preferences, or you might say, I would add self-definition, self-expression, the effects will be manifest in due course. It will matter to society. It's not a conversation. It's not an exploration of possibilities untethered from reality. It's a discussion about the human condition and its limits, and therefore the conditions of a stable society. Well, one last line from Elder Christofferson. A society, for example, in which individual consent is the only constraint on sexual activity is a society in decay. It's not just a society that we disapprove of because we happen to hold some opinions and other people have different opinions. If Elder Christofferson is right, it's a society in decay. That is not sustainable. That will not work. Am I afraid of the prospect of an unsustainable society? Yes, I say be afraid. Be very afraid. Don't lose your faith. Don't lose your confidence and goodwill. Don't lose your capacity to look people you disagree with in the eye and to listen to them, and even to bracket while listening your convictions in order to see where they're coming from. But don't lose your tethering to the realities of a sustainable society.
I want to finish on this here. So in the article, Patterson says the following: what is the alternative to Rauch that Hancock is proposing? Ultimately, Hancock's view of politics seems to be a pessimistic one. His formulation of the problem does not require much in the way of, and this is interesting that the verbiage here is, it does not seem to require much in the way of new efforts. It's interesting, new efforts from Latter-day Saints. Indeed, it seems to parrot the approach of those elements of modern Christianity who fervently embrace fear. Okay, so it just is coming back to this fear. And I just, again, if I'm walking away from those core principles, yes, there is reason to
towards some new approach, right?
Yeah, some new efforts that are not. I mean, the only thing he could substantiate here as far as being new efforts that he's talking about is actually the compromise with Rauch.
Yeah.
For example, I think of the Family Proclamation, and you go in, you get this outlining of order and tethering to certain principles, and then the bottom two paragraphs tell you, be afraid if we don't do this because this is what is going to happen.
Be afraid, be very afraid. And it's a proclamation to the world, and as you say, the last lines, which I should have memorized, but I don't, basically say, watch out if you ignore these principles.
Yeah. And that's not fear-mongering. I mean, if I read the scriptures the way that he's describing this, then the entirety of the scriptures is fear-mongering.
Yeah. Well, I think rhetorically we at least have to consider the legitimacy of turning this accusation of fear-mongering around, because really the fear at work here, and this is Kelly accuses me of resorting to a psychological argument here, and maybe I'll just plead guilty on this one. I've pled guilty on many points here. Why not add one more conviction here? I plead guilty to resorting to a psychological, or I would say more broadly, a socio-psychological argument, because I'm trying to find a way to explain what seems very puzzling, not to say baffling, not to say outrageous. Why are all these smart Latter-day Saints buying into this potion? That is clearly flimsy philosophically. I mean, I'm quite straightforward in saying Jonathan Rauch is no political philosopher, and Kelly says, well, he's not, and that doesn't matter because, we don't have we're not expecting political philosophy. Well, I'm saying something like the reasoning that you and I have been engaged in here that gets to the foundations of the meaning of liberalism and sees through the pretensions of liberal neutrality, something like political philosophy is necessary to see through these delusions and this rhetoric. But getting back to turning the tables on fear, I do resort to a social psychological argument to say that it must be. I welcome some other explanation, But I see this massive social phenomenon. Yes, among Latter-day Saint, I'm going to use fighting words here, elites, intellectuals.
I say that, yes.
Well, because we all need elites. Elites can be, a liberal society needs elites.
Sure.
We need the best, the most educated. But our elites tend to be pure and pure liberals. And alas, Latter-day Saints are no exception. And it's hard to be an exception. I'm old, I'm marginalized. It costs me little to be an exception. But for many, to stand apart from the liberal elite, more and more defined by a pure commitment to human freedom and equality without anthropological limits and without a higher reference point in God and nature. For many elites or would-be elites, this is an absolute condition of their membership in the group. In being, I'm not speaking of some explicit nefarious conspiracy. I'm just saying that what it means to be educated and what it means to be, progressive, what it means to be enlightened in our world is increasingly defined by beliefs like Jonathan Rauch's.
Mm-hmm.
And many, I hypothesize, I offer this possible explanation, many Latter-day Saints lose their hold on our core beliefs because they crave membership in the educated and enlightened and successful class. I don't think, I quote from a book by Joseph Bottom in which he describes the movement of white Protestant elites towards this progressive worldview. And forgive me if it seems a reductionist argument, but I'm looking for the best explanation I can. I see among Latter-day Saints this same tendency to interpret our very religion in terms that will not disqualify us from being among the enlightened progressive elites.
Yeah, so the apple, there is an apple.
Yeah.
The apple there is that acceptance to a degree, right? But that doesn't mean it's not poisoned. That doesn't mean it's not poisoned. So I agree with that. Ralph, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Very articulate. I love discussing these types of things, parsing them out. And if this is not something that you as in the audience have experienced yet, you will, right? Because these things are coming to a head. We are, as we discussed before we started recording, at a crossroads, I think, on these things. So, Ralph, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Greg.